She came to fix broken paintings. She didn't know she was the one being watched, and slowly, dangerously, chosen. This is a story about a woman who walked into a fortress of power, survived betrayal she never saw coming, and discovered that the most dangerous man in the room was also the one most afraid of losing her. If this story pulls you in from the first scene, hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels, and follow along because you do not want to miss what happens next. The morning Elena Hart decided to stop drowning, it was raining in Brooklyn, and her landlord's third notice was duct taped to her front door. She stood in the narrow hallway of her apartment building, still wearing yesterday's clothes, holding a cold cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink. The envelope was pale yellow, formal, the kind that didn't come with options. She peeled it off the door without reading it, stuffed it into her coat pocket with the other two, and went inside. The apartment smelled like turpentine and old wood, and something faintly sweet from the half-eaten granola bar on her workbench. Canvases leaned against every wall, some finished, most not, all belonging to clients who paid late or not at all. Her restoration tools were laid out on a folding table by the window: scalpels, soft brushes, tiny vials of solvents, a magnifying lens on a flexible arm. It was a professional setup crammed into a 400-square-foot apartment in Greenpoint, and it had cost her every dollar of her savings 3 years ago when she'd left the conservation lab at the museum and decided to go independent. Independence, she had discovered, was another word for alone. She sat at the workbench and opened her laptop, checked her bank balance, closed it. The number had been the same for 2 weeks, $47 and change. Enough for groceries, not enough for rent, not even close. Elena was 31 years old. She had a master's degree in fine art conservation from NYU. She had worked on a Caravaggio once, a real one, on loan from a museum in Naples, and her supervisor had told her afterward that her hands were the steadiest he'd ever seen on someone under 40. She had a gift, he'd said, genuine instinct for the work. You could teach technique, you couldn't teach feel. What you couldn't teach, she had also learned, was how to make a living off it. She pulled the yellow envelopes out of her pocket, set all 3 on the workbench in a row, stared at them. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it, expecting her landlord's number. Instead, it was an email notification. Unknown sender, subject line reading only. Restoration opportunity. Private estate, Manhattan. Immediate start. Compensation negotiable. She almost ignored it. She'd gotten emails like this before, usually from wealthy collectors who wanted her to authenticate something questionable or clean a painting that had no business being touched outside a professional lab. Negotiable was always another word for low, but she opened it anyway, because $47 and 3 yellow envelopes had a way of adjusting a person's standards. The email was short. No company letterhead, no signature beyond an initial, V, and a phone number with a 212 area code. It read, "We have acquired several Renaissance works in need of immediate professional restoration. The pieces are fragile and require on-site work at our estate in Manhattan. The position includes private accommodation for the duration of the project, full materials, and a weekly compensation of $4,000. If interested, call before noon today." Elena read it twice. Then she read it a third time. $4,000 a week. On-site accommodation, which meant no rent. Renaissance works, which meant real work. The kind she'd trained for, the kind that actually mattered. She looked at the clock. It was 11:14. She called. The man who answered had a voice like a closed door, measured, accented, unhurried. He told her someone would come to assess her credentials that afternoon. She said fine. He said good. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. At 3 o'clock, a black car pulled up outside her building. A man in a dark coat came upstairs, looked at her workspace without touching anything, examined the certifications on her wall, and asked her 3 questions. Whether she'd worked with varnish removal on pre-17th century oils, whether she had experience with gesso ground instability, and whether she could begin on Monday. She said yes to all 3. He handed her a card with an address on the Upper East Side, told her to bring only personal belongings and her own tools, and left without giving his name. Elena stood in the middle of her apartment for a long moment after he was gone. The rain had stopped. The light through the window was thin and gray. She looked at the unfinished canvases, the folding table, the 3 yellow envelopes. Then she started packing. She told herself it was just a job. A good one, finally. That was all. She was wrong about that, but she wouldn't understand why until much later. Until she was already too deep inside the silence of that mansion to pretend she hadn't chosen to walk toward it. Monday arrived cold and overcast. Elena took the subway to 86th Street with a rolling suitcase and a hard case of tools, then walked 6 blocks east following the address on the card. The building she found didn't look like a private residence from the outside. It looked like an institution. 4 stories of pale limestone with iron fencing along the perimeter, a gate with no visible intercom, security cameras at every corner, and not a single window facing the street at ground level. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than she meant to. A buzzer sounded before she touched the gate. It swung open. A young woman in dark clothing met her at the front door. Mid-20s, posture like a soldier, eyes that categorized quickly and gave nothing back. She introduced herself only as Calla and led Elena inside without waiting to see if she followed. The entry hall was something else entirely. High ceilings, herringbone marble floors, a staircase that curved upward in a single clean arc. The art on the walls was real. She could see that immediately, the particular way old pigment held light differently from reproduction prints. A portrait near the door looked early Dutch. A landscape in the far corridor felt Venetian. She slowed without meaning to. "Please keep moving," Calla said. Not unkind, just efficient. Elena kept moving. She was taken through the main floor, down a corridor lined with closed doors, and into a wing at the back of the house that had been converted into a working conservation space. It was better equipped than most professional labs she'd been in. Climate-controlled, humidity-monitored, with a full bank of UV and infrared lighting rigs, a wide central work table, and 3 paintings already positioned on easels, draped in conservation cloth. Against one wall, a narrow door opened into a small bedroom. Clean, sparse, a single window that looked onto an interior courtyard. Her name was written on a card on the bedside table. "Mr. Varela will meet with you at 6, Calla said. "Until then, you may review the works and begin your condition reports." "Can I ask what happened to the last restorer?" Calla looked at her. "There was no last restorer. These works have not been touched in some time." "How long?" "That will be part of your assessment." She moved toward the door. "There is coffee in the cabinet. Meals are at 7, 12, and 7. If you need anything from the outside, submit a list by 9 in the morning and it will be handled." Then she was gone, and Elena was alone in the most well-equipped workspace she'd ever stood in, inside a house that felt like it was built specifically to keep the outside world from getting in. She set down her cases, rolled her shoulders, walked to the first easel, and lifted the corner of the conservation cloth. The painting beneath stopped her breath. It was a panel work, tempera on wood, which dated it somewhere before the wide adoption of canvas in the mid-16th century. The subject was a woman, seated, looking not at the viewer but at something slightly to the left of frame, her hands folded in her lap with a particular kind of stillness that wasn't peace but patience. The pigment had shifted over centuries. The blues had gone green in places. The darks had sunk and crazed. There was blanching along the left edge where moisture had gotten in at some point. But beneath all of that, the draftsmanship was extraordinary. The modeling of the face, the way light broke across the bridge of the nose, the weight in the eyes. It was the work of someone who understood bone structure and grief simultaneously. Elena stood in front of it for a long time, longer than was strictly professional. Then she got to work. By 5 o'clock, she had completed condition reports on all 3 works. The panel painting was the most complex. It had active cleavage in the ground layer along the lower third that would need consolidation before anything else could be touched. And there were areas of overpainting from a previous incompetent restoration that needed to be mapped before removal. The second piece, a small oil on copper, was in better shape, mainly surface dirt and a yellowed varnish layer that had obscured the original color relationships entirely. The third was the most damaged, a canvas with a long diagonal tear through the lower right quadrant, old wax lining that had failed along the edges, and a history of water damage that had left tide marks across the midground. All 3 were solvable. All 3 would take weeks, minimum. She was writing up her materials list when the door to the conservation room opened without a knock. Elena turned. The man who stood in the doorway was not what she had assembled in her imagination over the course of the day. She had expected someone older, someone soft with old money, Someone who collected art the way people collected status symbols, to have it, not to understand it. Massimo Varela was none of that. He was somewhere in his early 40s, lean in the way that wasn't about effort but constitution, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had been lived in rather than maintained. He was dressed plainly, dark trousers, a gray shirt with the sleeves turned back twice at the wrist. No watch that she could see. No jewelry. Nothing that announced wealth except the complete absence of any need to announce it. He looked at her the way she had looked at the panel painting earlier, not assessing, something more still than that, like recognition of something already understood. "Ms. Hart," he said. "Mr. Varela." He walked into the room without invitation, which was technically his right since it was his house, but it still registered as a particular kind of permission-taking. He stopped at the first easel, looked at the panel painting, then at her condition report on the table. "Your assessment? The ground layer is lifting. I need to consolidate before anything else. I'd recommend paraloid B72 in a low concentration, 5% in acetone, applied with a fine brush under the cleave. Let it draw in under gravity first, then light pressure with a heated spatula." He looked at the painting, not her. And the overpainting? Previous restorer made it worse. Whoever they were, they filled losses with paint that doesn't match the original medium, probably in the last 40 years based on the synthetic binders. I can map it under UV tonight and start removal planning tomorrow. But that's a conversation. Some of it might be better left alone depending on what's underneath. I want everything original visible. That's not always possible. He turned and looked at her then, not surprised. Something closer to interested. Why not? Because removal means risk. If the original layer beneath the overpaint is compromised, you take off the bad paint and you're left with nothing. Sometimes the honest answer is that a previous damage is now part of the object's history, and the best you can do is make it legible rather than invisible. A pause. He looked back at the painting. "You are the first person who has said that to me. Most people tell clients what they want to hear. And you don't?" "I find it wastes time," Elena said, "for both parties." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite approval. Something in between that she didn't have a name for yet. "Dinner is at 7, he said. "You should eat." He left the same way he'd entered. No transition, no social softening, just presence, then the absence of it. Elena stood very still for a moment. Then she turned back to the panel painting, picked up her magnifying lens, and got back to work. She told herself the conversation had been nothing. Professional, direct, appropriate. She told herself that twice, which was one time too many to actually believe it. Dinner that evening was served in a room off the main corridor. Not the formal dining room she'd glimpsed through a half-open door earlier, which was the kind of room that required an occasion, but a smaller space. Round table, 6 chairs, plain linen. Callis set a plate in front of her without ceremony. Roasted chicken, root vegetables, bread. A glass of water. Simple, precise, good. She ate alone. Or she thought she was alone until she heard footsteps in the corridor, a low exchange of voices, and then silence again. Through the half-open door, she could see a sliver of the main hall. And in that sliver, 2 men. One was Massimo. The other was younger, maybe early 30s, with the kind of handsome that announced itself before the face fully registered. Dark suit, open collar, one hand gesturing with the easy authority of someone who had never been told to lower it. She caught a fragment of Italian, sharp vowels. The younger man's voice had laughter in it that didn't match his posture. Then Massimo said something low, and the laughter stopped. Elena looked down at her plate. She didn't need to understand the language to understand what she'd just witnessed. She'd seen that dynamic before, though, not in a mansion, but in the conservation lab at the museum, between a senior curator and a junior one who'd overstepped. The way authority didn't raise its voice because it didn't need to. The way a single sentence at the right register could close a conversation that had been opened too loudly. She finished eating quickly and went back to her room. That night, she lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of a house that was never fully quiet, even when all the people in it were still. Somewhere overhead there were footsteps. Outside her window, the interior courtyard caught sound from the street and turned it into something distant and abstract, like traffic heard through water. She thought about the panel painting, about the woman in it with her careful hands and her averted eyes, about what the restorer before her had done, covering the damage rather than addressing it, painting over the instability with synthetic color that didn't belong, making it look whole from a distance when underneath the ground was still lifting, still separating, still moving slowly away from itself. It was, she thought, a particular kind of dishonesty, one that required both skill and intention to execute. She fell asleep thinking about the painting. She was not thinking about Massimo Varela. That was what she told herself. By Wednesday, she had begun the consolidation work on the panel painting, working in the early morning hours when the light in the conservation room was steady and the house was quiet. The paraloid solution was drawing well into the cleave. She could see the tissue paper she'd laid over the surface beginning to flatten as the adhesive pulled the lifted ground back toward the support. Slow work. Patient work. The kind that couldn't be hurried without consequences. He appeared at 11. No knock. She'd noticed by now that he never knocked, but that there was always a half-second pause in his step before he opened a door, as though announcing himself without words. She wasn't sure if that was courtesy or habit. He set a coffee on the table beside her. Black, which was how she drank it, though she hadn't told anyone that. She glanced at it. Thank you. He stood at the edge of the workspace and watched her work for a while. Not hovering, he kept clear of her table, gave her room, but present in a way that was impossible to ignore. She'd worked with collectors before who watched, and it usually felt like surveillance. This felt different, more like the way she watched the paintings. The copper one, she said without looking up. The oil. Do you know its provenance before 1960? I have documentation back to the mid-1800s. And before that? Unclear. There's something in the lower left corner under the varnish. I won't know what it is until I start cleaning, but the texture reads as a collector's mark. If I can identify it, it might help fill the gap. Would that change how you treat the painting? No, but it changes what the painting is. He considered that. You think provenance matters to the object. I think everything that's happened to an object is part of what it is. You can't separate the history from the thing. A pause. Some people would prefer to. Some people would, she agreed. Doesn't make it true. She looked up from the work then, just briefly. He was watching her with that same still expression. Not blank, not cold, but contained. Like a room where all the furniture had been pushed to the walls to create space for something in the center that wasn't there yet. She looked back down. The younger man from last night, she said. Is he family? A beat of silence. My nephew, Raphael. He'll be around? He lives in the East Wing. She nodded once, filed it, kept working. By the end of the week, she had a rhythm. Morning consolidation on the panel painting, afternoon UV mapping of the overpainting, an hour at the end of each day writing up her notes and photographing progress. Calla brought her meals when she asked and left her alone when she didn't. The household moved around her like water around a fixed object, accommodating without acknowledgement. Massimo came to the conservation room every day. Sometimes twice, always with coffee, always silent at first, occasionally asking a question that was more precise than it looked, the kind that revealed he'd thought about it before asking. He'd read about the works. She could tell. Not casually. Seriously, the way someone reads when they actually want to understand something rather than know it. She found herself answering at greater length than she intended. On Friday evening, she was cleaning the UV light rig when she heard voices in the corridor. 2 of them, female, low, and rapid. She caught her own name, or thought she did. She set down the lamp and stood very still. The voices moved away before she could parse anything else, but the quality of them stayed with her. Not hostile exactly, but edged. The way voices went when they were discussing a problem they hadn't agreed on a solution for. She was, she understood, a variable that several people in this house had not voted for. Saturday morning, Raphael appeared in her workspace for the first time. He was better looking up close than he'd been as a half-seen figure in the corridor, the kind of face that knew its own effect and had spent years calibrating it into an instrument. He leaned in the doorway with a posture of complete ease that Elena recognized immediately as performance. True ease didn't announce itself. The famous restorer, he said. His English was accented but fluent, with an American overlay that suggested time spent here. I've been meaning to come say hello. Hello, Elena said. She was standing at the copper painting, brush in hand, halfway through a test clean on a small area in the upper corner. He walked in. She noticed he didn't look at the paintings. How are you finding the house? Functional. He smiled. It reached his eyes, which was more unsettling than if it hadn't. Massimo is not the most welcoming host. I'm not here as a guest. No. He stopped a few feet from her work table. What are you here as, exactly? She looked at him steadily. A conservator? It's in the contract. Of course. He glanced at the painting, finally, with the slightly glazed look of someone performing interest. These things are worth a great deal, I understand. They're worth more than money. But yes, you must be very good to be trusted with them. I am, she said. He laughed, genuine, briefly, as though she'd surprised him. I'll let you work, he said. Welcome to the house, Ms. Hart. After he left, Elena stood for a moment with her brush suspended over the test area. She put the brush down, rolled her shoulders slowly, and picked it back up. She didn't like him. She couldn't have said precisely why. Nothing he'd done was overtly wrong, but she'd learned over years of working in fragile spaces that surface ease in a person, when it was performed rather than felt, usually meant they were working towards something underneath it. She'd seen it in the conservation world, the colleague who complimented your technique while positioning to take credit for your findings, the collector who praised your professionalism while testing how far he could push the contract terms. Raphael had the posture of someone who was already several moves into a game she hadn't agreed to play. She noted it, filed it, and kept working. The following week was quieter in the common spaces and louder in the walls. She caught fragments, Italian she couldn't translate, a raised voice once that cut off abruptly, Calla moving through the corridors with a face even more closed than usual. Something was in motion in the house, a machinery she couldn't see the mechanism of, and she was aware of it the way you're aware of a current in still water. Her work, at least, was going well. The panel painting's consolidation had held beautifully. She'd rehumidified and pressed the cleavage flat, and it was sitting stable, the tissue paper removed, the surface intact. She was ready to begin cleaning tests on the varnish. The copper painting was revealing itself slowly under her solvent, the yellowed layer lifting to show a sky that was not the muddy gray she'd assumed, but a vivid, almost luminous blue-gray, the color of the hour between last light and dark. She spent longer than necessary on the test area, just looking at it. On Tuesday of the second week, Massimo came later than usual, almost midnight. Elena was still in the workspace, working under the lamp on varnish removal, the kind of careful mechanical work that was almost meditative once you found the rhythm of it. He came in, sat in the chair by the door rather than standing. That was different. She glanced at him. He looked tired, not physically. His posture was the same, but in some deeper register, something behind the eyes. She went back to her work. The blue, he said after a while, meaning the copper painting, the test area she'd exposed. What about it? I didn't know it was there. Most people don't know what's under the surface until someone takes the time to look. She kept her brush moving. That's the job. Silence. Is it always like this? He asked. The work? Like what? He was quiet for a moment, uncovering something that was always there but hidden. She stopped, set the swab down, looked at him directly. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it is. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. He left not long after, and she stood in the quiet of the workspace with the smell of solvent on her hands and the painting in front of her slowly returning to what it had always been. The blue deepened as she watched it dry, true color finding its way back to the light. Elena pressed her fingertips against the edge of the work table. She was in trouble, and she knew it, and knowing it didn't help at all. On Thursday, a woman appeared at the entrance of the conservation wing that Elena had not seen before. Older than Raphael, younger than Massimo, somewhere in her mid-30s, with the kind of black hair that was maintenance rather than nature, cut to the jaw. She wore dark clothes with the kind of restraint that was itself a statement. She stood in the doorway and looked at Elena the way you look at a new piece of furniture that's been put in a room it doesn't belong in. You're the restorer, she said, not a question. Elena Hart. Juliana. No last name. It hung in the air the way a last name would have if it needed to. Elena set down her brush. "Can I help you?"
I was curious. Her eyes moved around the room. The equipment, the paintings, the tools laid out with Elena's particular order. "You've made yourself at home." "I've organized a workspace." "Yes." Juliana's gaze returned to her. "Massimo seems interested in the project. He's engaged with his collection. That's not unusual for serious collectors." "No." A pause that lasted a beat too long. "It's not the collection that interests me." She left before Elena could answer that.
Elena picked up her brush. Her hand was steady. Her jaw wasn't. The formal family dinner was announced on Friday. Sunday evening, the whole household dress accordingly. Kala delivered the information with the same neutrality she delivered everything, but there was something in the brevity of it that felt like warning. Elena spent Saturday trying to decide if she should invent a reason not to attend, and concluded that inventing reasons was exactly the kind of small dishonesty she'd built her professional life around refusing. If she was in this house, she was in it. She would not perform discomfort she hadn't earned yet. She pressed the only dress she'd brought, dark green, simple, the one she wore to gallery openings when she was asked, and told herself it would be fine. Sunday evening arrived like a weather system. The dining room was the one she'd glimpsed through the door on her first night. Large, formal, a table that seated 12 though only 8 seats were laid. Candles, crystal, the particular silence of a room arranged for impact. Massimo was already standing when she entered, at the far end near the window. He looked at her once, briefly, and something in his expression shifted by a fraction. Recognition, maybe, or something warmer than that. He looked away before she could read it clearly. Raphael was there. Juliana. 3 other people she hadn't met. A middle-aged woman with Massimo's cheekbones who was introduced only as his aunt, a quiet older man who didn't give his name, and a young woman attached to Raphael's arm who smiled at Elena in the way that people smile when they want you to feel welcome but are counting on you not to be. Dinner began formally. The conversation moved in Italian with occasional English passages that felt like concessions rather than inclusions. Elena ate and listened and said little. Massimo, at the head of the table, ate less than anyone and said even less. But she felt him aware of her the way you feel weather before it turns. As a pressure rather than a temperature. Raphael was charming throughout. Too much so. He talked about the paintings, about the work she was doing, translated for the table with a performance of admiration that made her want to check what he was actually saying. Dessert came. The conversation became wine-loosened, louder. Then Juliana said, in careful English, "Raphael, didn't you misplace something this week?" The table didn't exactly go quiet, but it tilted. Raphael looked up from his glass with an expression of concerned surprise that had been constructed rather than felt. "Ah," he said. "Yes. My grandmother's necklace. The sapphire one." He looked at Elena. Kala thought she saw it in the restoration wing. Elena set down her fork. "The necklace has been in the family for 60 years, Juliana said, looking at Elena without inflection. "It's irreplaceable." "I haven't seen a necklace," Elena said. "Perhaps we should look," Raphael said. Pleasantly. "Just to be sure. These things are misplaced." Massimo had not moved. He was looking at the table. Kala appeared from the side door and set a small velvet pouch on the table beside Elena's place setting. It was found in the pocket of the supply cabinet, near Ms. Hart's work table. The silence was instantaneous, complete, the kind that fell when everyone in a room had already arrived at a conclusion. Elena looked at the pouch, then at Raphael. His face was careful, concerned, regretful, the precise calibration of a man who wanted to appear reluctant to think what everyone at the table was thinking. She looked at Massimo. He was still looking at the table. His jaw was tight. He had not spoken. That was the moment. That specific weighted silence where he chose not to act, where his stillness read as judgment when it might have been calculation, and where the difference between the two was invisible from where she sat. Something inside her went cold, and then, underneath the cold, something hardened. She pushed back her chair. The sound of it cut through the room. "I did not take that necklace," she said. Her voice was even, not loud. "And I won't sit at a table where the assumption is that I did." She looked at Raphael,
who had the audacity to look sorrowful. She did not look at Massimo again. She walked out of the dining room with her back straight and her hands steady, and the blood pounding in her ears so loudly she couldn't hear if anyone spoke behind her, through the corridor, into the conservation wing, into her room.
She sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands were shaking now. She let them. There was no one to see it. She looked at the wall for a long time, at the single window looking onto the courtyard, at the card with her name on the bedside table that had been there since the first day. Then she opened her suitcase and began to fold clothes into it. She would finish the night here. She would take her tools in the morning. She would leave this house and whatever it was, opportunity, trap, something she had no name for yet, and she would not look back at any of it. She would especially not think about a man at the head of a table, jaw tight, eyes down, saying absolutely nothing. She was nearly done packing when she heard footsteps stop outside her door, and then a knock. The first one, she realized, that anyone in this house had ever given her. And Massimo's voice, low and controlled, came through the wood. "Ms. Hart, don't leave tonight." She stared at the door. "There will be an investigation," he said. "Internal, by morning." Elena's hand rested on the lid of her suitcase. She did not open the door. She did not close the suitcase either. Elena did not open the door. She stood with her hand on the suitcase lid and listened to the silence on the other side of the wood and thought about the particular quality of Massimo Varella's voice. How it didn't rise, didn't soften, didn't do anything that voices did when they wanted something from you. It simply stated. Like weather. Like a fact already in the process of being true. She thought about this dinner table, the velvet pouch set beside her plate with the precision of something rehearsed, Raphael's careful sorrow, Juliana's flat eyes, the aunt with Massimo's cheekbones looking down at her dessert as though the whole affair was distasteful but not surprising. And Massimo, jaw tight, eyes on the table, saying nothing for the 10 seconds that mattered most. "Ms. Hart," his voice again, still level, not louder. "I heard you," she said. A pause. "Then you understand. I understand that you're asking me to stay in a house where someone just accused me of theft in front of your entire family. Yes. And your argument is that you'll look into it. My argument," he said, "is that I know you didn't take it." She took her hand off the suitcase. The silence stretched. She could hear her own breathing, too fast, too shallow. She made herself slow it down. "Then why didn't you say that at the table?" she asked. No answer came immediately, and the absence of one was more honest than whatever words might have followed it, which was either the most infuriating thing she'd encountered in recent memory or the most unexpectedly decent. She crossed the room and opened the door. He was standing in the corridor without ceremony. No jacket now, sleeves still turned back, the fatigue she'd seen in his eyes 2 nights ago sitting closer to the surface. He looked at her directly, which was something she'd noticed about him. He didn't look away from difficult things. He looked at them the way you looked at damage in a painting, with assessment rather than avoidance. "I was calculating," he said, "at my expense." "Yes." He didn't dress it up. That was wrong. She studied him. You could have said something, 5 words. It would have been enough. "I know. So why didn't you?" He looked at her for a moment, that same quality of looking, as if she were a surface he was trying to read the depth of, and then said, "Because I needed to understand what Raphael was doing before I stopped him. If I defended you immediately, he would have pulled back and regrouped. Now I know the shape of it." Elena leaned against the door frame. Her arms were folded. "So I was bait. You were protected. There's a difference. From where I was sitting, there wasn't." He accepted that. No deflection, just a slight tightening around the eyes that might have been the closest he came to guilt. "Don't leave tonight," he said again. "By morning I'll have answers. If you still want to leave then, I won't stop you." She looked at him for a long moment. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. "I want access to the surveillance footage," she said. "You'll have it. And I want to know what's actually happening in this house. Not managed information, the real shape of it." Something in his expression shifted. Not discomfort, but consideration. The kind of consideration that preceded a decision. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." He turned and walked back down the corridor. She watched him go. Then she went back into her room, sat on the edge of the bed again, and did not open the suitcase further. She did not sleep for a long time. Morning came gray and cold. Elena was already at her workbench by 6, not because she was calm enough to work, but because standing still was worse. She had her notes open in front of her and was staring at them without reading when Calla appeared at 7 with coffee and a face that was carefully, professionally blank, but not blank in the same way as usual. There was something held behind it. Elena took the coffee. Calla. Ms. Hart, were you told to put that pouch next to my place setting? A pause. Short, but real. I was asked to set the table according to Mr. Raphael's instructions that evening. And the instructions included the pouch. The instructions included several specific placements. Her voice was even. I followed them. Did you know what was in it? Calla looked at her steadily. I was told it was a personal item of Mr. Raphael's that he wanted to display. And did that seem normal to you? A longer pause this time. Calla set the coffee tray down on the side table with a precision that was itself a form of composure. I follow instructions, Ms. Hart. It's not my role to interpret them. No, Elena said. I understand that. Calla moved toward the door, stopped. Without turning, she said, The camera in the supply corridor, the one at the east corner, it has a wider capture angle than the others. I thought you should know that. Then she was gone. Elena held her coffee cup with both hands and thought about the specific weight of what had just been handed to her. Not stated. Handed, with deniability still intact. She put the cup down and went to find Massimo. He was in a room she hadn't been in before. A study at the far end of the main floor, books on 3 walls, a desk that faced the window and the interior courtyard. He was on the phone when she knocked, the first time she'd knocked in this house, which felt like a shift she was aware of making deliberately. He looked up, said something short into the phone, and ended the call. The east corridor camera, she said, coming in. Calla told me it has a wider angle. He was already nodding. I pulled the footage last night. And? He turned the laptop on the desk to face her. The footage was time-stamped Sunday evening, 1743, an hour and 15 minutes before dinner, the corridor outside the supply room. The angle was wide enough to catch the supply cabinet in the lower right of the frame. Raphael walked into frame at 1744. He was carrying something in his left hand, small, the size of a fist. He opened the supply cabinet. His back was to the camera for 11 seconds. When he turned back, his hand was empty. He smoothed his jacket, looked once in both directions. Left frame. Elena watched it through twice. The second time, without the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. How long have you known? She asked. Since 3 this morning. And Raphael? Massimo's jaw set. He's been told to remain in the east wing until I'm ready to speak with him. Does he know about the footage? No. She straightened up. What does this mean for the rest of the household? He looked at her, that direct, measuring look. It means exactly what I said it means. I know what he did. I know why. Now I decide what to do about it. What does he want? Elena asked. What's the actual goal here? Massimo was quiet for a moment. He turned the laptop back around. Raphael believes he should have more influence over the collection, over several decisions I've made recently. A pause. Your presence here represented a decision he didn't agree with. He went through this much trouble because he doesn't like who you hired? This isn't about you specifically. He said it cleanly, without apology. You were an available mechanism. Elena absorbed that. It wasn't a comfortable thing to absorb. The idea that she'd been targeted not from malice but from convenience, slotted into someone else's chess game as a disposable piece. Does this happen often? She asked. Family members running operations against each other in your house? Something moved across his face. Too quick to name. No, he said. Not openly. What does that mean? He didn't answer that. Instead, he said, Do you want to leave? She thought about the panel painting upstairs, the blue sky emerging on the copper, the tear in the canvas she hadn't started on yet. She thought about $47 and the yellow envelopes. And then she thought about all of that again and recognized she was using it to avoid the more uncomfortable answer. No, she said. Not yet. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already calculated. She turned to go, then stopped. The investigation. When you confront him, I want to be present. That's not, he used me, she said. I'm not asking. A pause, long enough that it had meaning. This afternoon, Massimo said. 3 o'clock. She went back to her workshop. She worked through the morning with a focus that was almost aggressive, driving herself into the detail of the varnish removal on the copper painting, the swab, the solvent, the careful lifting of a century of yellowed surface in millimeter increments. The blue sky continued to emerge. The original color relationship between sky and midground started to become visible, and it was different from what the discolored varnish had suggested. Warmer, with a thin red glaze in the trees at the horizon that shifted the whole mood of the piece. It was good work, the kind that made the rest of the world temporarily irrelevant. At 11:30, Raphael appeared in her doorway. He looked different from Sunday. The performance of ease was still there, but running on less power. Something underneath it showing through. He stepped into the room without invitation, which was the same thing he'd done the first time, but this time there was an edge to it, like he was testing whether she'd object. She didn't. She kept working.
I wanted to apologize, he said. Did you? The necklace. It was a mistake. She set down her swab, turned and looked at him with both hands at her sides. No, she said. A mistake is leaving the necklace somewhere and forgetting where you put it. What you did was put it somewhere and watch what happened. His expression shifted, just slightly, the manufactured regret dropping by a fraction. You're very direct. What do you actually want, Raphael? I want things to be comfortable here, for everyone. That's not an answer. He tilted his head. The charm was still running, but underneath it now she could see the mechanism of it. The way it was deployed rather than felt, like a tool that had been used so long the user had forgotten what his face looked like without it. You're smart, he said. Massimo doesn't usually choose people who are smart. I wasn't chosen. I was hired. Is there a difference?
She looked at him. Yes, a significant one. He smiled. It had something sharp in it now that had been hidden the first time. He'll decide you're a liability eventually. He always does. The closer someone gets to him, the more careful he has to be about them. It's not personal. It's structural. You're telling me this because you care about my feelings? I'm telling you this because I think you're capable of reading the room. He glanced at the paintings. You study surfaces for a living. You know what things look like underneath. I know what paintings look like underneath, she said. I don't know you. No, he agreed. But you will. He left. Elena stood in the middle of her workspace and felt the specific cold of someone who has just been warned, not threatened, warned, and understood that the distinction was meant to make her feel that she had a choice in what came next. She picked up her swab and went back to work. 3 o'clock arrived with a weight to it. The study was the same room from the morning, but it felt different with 3 people in it. Smaller, more pressurized. Massimo stood behind the desk. Elena stood to one side. Raphael came in at exactly 3, which told her he'd been informed of the time and had chosen punctuality as his strategy, the way punctuality sometimes functioned as a form of aggression. He saw Elena and something crossed his face. Not surprise. Recalculation. Elena stays, Massimo said, before Raffaele could speak. This is a family matter. The matter involves her. She stays. Raffaele sat down with the ease of someone who had decided ease was his best weapon in this room. He folded his hands in his lap, looked at Massimo with an openness that was its own kind of armor. Massimo turned the laptop around, played the footage. The room was silent for the 11 seconds of it. When it finished, Raphael looked at the screen for a moment. Then he looked up at Massimo with an expression that had dropped all its performance. What was underneath was not guilt. It was something more complicated, a long, accrued frustration that had the color of old resentment. You were going to give it to her anyway, Raphael said. The Cortona panel. You were going to authorize the full restoration without consulting anyone. The collection is mine to manage. The collection belongs to the family. No, Massimo said, flat. It doesn't. You've been making decisions for 3 years that affect everyone here, and you consult no one. You bring in an outsider, a glance at Elena,
and give her access to pieces that have been in this family for generations. And we're supposed to simply, you planted evidence on an employee, Massimo said. The quietness of it was more effective than volume. In my house, at my table. I wanted her gone. I know what you wanted. And I wanted you to see how easily it worked. Raphael's voice had gone flat now, all the charm stripped out of it. How quickly everyone looked at her instead of looking at me. How much you trust a stranger over your own family. I looked at the camera, Massimo said, not at her. Because I made a mistake with the timing. Yes, you did. The two of them looked at each other across the desk, and Elena stood at the edge of it and understood that she was witnessing something that had been building for years. A particular kind of family damage that didn't come from a single event, but from the accumulation of small exclusions, unmade inheritances, a slow-growing certainty of being less than what you'd expected to become, none of which, she thought, was her problem, none of which made what he'd done to her acceptable. The necklace, she said. Both men looked at her. Where's the actual necklace? The real one. Raphael's jaw shifted. East wing, my room. Your grandmother's necklace, she said. You used it. Something flashed across his face. The first genuine thing she'd seen from him. Not guilt, not shame, but a flicker of something that might once have been connected to those things. It was gone quickly. Get it, Massimo said. Massimo. Get it now, Raffaele. He got up and left the room. The silence after the door closed had a different quality. Elena looked at Massimo. The fatigue around his eyes had deepened, and beneath the control there was something else. Not weakness, but the specific heaviness of someone doing something that had required a long time to decide to do. How long has this been building? She asked. Long enough? Is this the worst of it? He looked at her. No. She sat down in the chair Raphael had vacated, not performing comfort, just acknowledging that her legs were tired. What haven't you told me? Many things. He came around the desk and sat on the edge of it rather than behind it. Closer. Not close, but closer. Raphael is not the only concern. He was the loudest this week. Juliana. Among others. What does she want? She wants the same thing Raphael wants. He looked at the window, the courtyard, the afternoon light flattening on the stone. Authority, legitimacy. Proof that what they believe they're owed will actually come to them. And won't it? He looked back at her. Not the way they've imagined it. Before she could ask what that meant, Raphael returned. He set the necklace on the desk between them. Sapphires set in old platinum, the kind of thing that had been worn and loved and handed down through decades of specific hands. He set it down like it cost him something. Massimo looked at it, then at Raphael. You'll move your things to the guest house on the east property, he said. You'll have no access to the main house without a direct invitation from me. Your involvement in collection decisions is suspended indefinitely. Raphael went very still. The staff will be informed this evening. Callow will coordinate the transition. You're exiling me, Raphael said. The charm was completely gone now. What was left was younger looking, rawer. For this, Massimo said, and for what this represents. You would do this to your own family. Not a question. An accusation assembled from years of something. You did this, Massimo said. Not me. Raffaele looked at Elena then, a look with weight in it, not threatened but memorizing, as if he were storing her face for a future use she couldn't anticipate yet. Then he picked up nothing from the desk, turned around, and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a soft, decisive click. Elena and Massimo sat in the quiet. She became aware that she was sitting in his chair. She didn't move. Is it over? She asked. He looked at the necklace on the desk. With Raphael? For now. And the rest of it? He was quiet for a moment. Juliana will recalibrate. The others will watch to see what this means for their own positions. He picked up the necklace, turned it once in his hand. Nothing in this house is resolved in a single afternoon. No, she said. I imagine not. He set the necklace down again, looked at her with the full weight of that direct gaze. You handled yourself well. I asked a question about a piece of jewelry. You stayed, he said. Last night. You stayed. She looked at him for a moment. Don't read too much into that. I still haven't decided if it was the right call. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. The architecture of one, maybe. No, he said. Neither have I. She stood up, smoothed her clothes, and walked back toward the door. Ms. Hart. She stopped, turned. I'll have your dinner sent to the workshop tonight if you prefer. I'd prefer that, she said. Yes. She went back to her paintings. She worked through the evening with the specific concentration of someone using craft to quiet something inside them that won't stay quiet on its own. The copper painting sky continued to reveal itself, blue and clear and old, the work of a hand that had been dead for 400 years, still communicating something precise and real through the surface of time. She ate the food Kala brought without tasting it. She wrote her notes. She photographed the day's progress. At 10, she heard footsteps pass her door without stopping, measured, familiar. She kept her eyes on the painting. What she did not do was acknowledge, to herself or anyone, the very specific way the day had reorganized something in her chest. How the morning's cold anger had somewhere in its passage become something else. Not warmth, not softness. Something she didn't have a name for that sat at the base of her sternum and refused to be filed away with the day's other observations. She was in trouble. She knew it. She turned off the light above the copper painting and went to bed. She was almost asleep when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text. 3 words. This isn't finished. She stared at the screen for a long moment. The number had a 212 area code, but it wasn't the one from the original job offer. She'd never seen it before. She didn't reply. She set the phone face down on the nightstand. In the darkness of the room, with the sounds of the house settling around her, Elena Hart lay still and understood that whatever calculation she had been part of, whatever use she had been put to by forces she still only partially understood, the rules of it had just... She didn't sleep after the text. She lay in the dark with the phone face down on the nightstand and watched the ceiling and thought about the 212 area code and the 3 words and the particular quality of a warning that arrives without signature. Not Raffaele. He was already stripped of leverage, already in the process of being moved to the guest house, already too exposed to risk another direct move this quickly. Someone else. Someone who had been watching the whole thing from further back. At 2 a.m, she got up and went to her work table. Not to work, just to sit somewhere that felt like hers. She turned on the small lamp above the copper painting and looked at the sky she'd uncovered over the past week. That blue. That specific 400-year-old blue that had been sitting underneath the yellowed varnish the whole time, waiting for someone to have the patience to find it. She thought about what Massimo had said. Nothing in this house is resolved in a single afternoon. She thought about what Raphael had said before that. The closer someone gets to him, the more careful he has to be about them. She turned off the lamp and went back to bed. She did not reply to the text. In the morning, she showed it to Massimo. He read it twice. His face did not change in any way that was readable from the outside, but she'd been watching him for 2 weeks now, and she could see the quality of stillness shift, something sharpening underneath it, the way water looks different when the depth changes beneath a surface that appears the same. When did this come in? 10:47, after I went to bed. He set the phone on the desk between them. Did you reply? No. He looked at the number for a moment, then he picked up his own phone, sent a message she couldn't see, and set it back down. I'll have it traced. Who is it? I have a suspicion. He didn't elaborate. Don't reply. Don't delete it. Are you going to tell me your suspicion? He looked at her. Not yet. That's not acceptable, she said. I understand that. Massimo. She waited until he was looking at her fully. I stayed. I'm still here. I handed you the text instead of calling the police or simply leaving. At some point, you have to give me enough information to make an informed decision about whether being in this house is actually safe. A long pause. He picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking. There are people outside this house who have an interest in the collection, he said carefully. The same way Raphael does, but with different tools available to them. The Underworld, she said flatly. Let's not do the careful language. Something in his expression tightened. Yes. And they know I'm here. They know everything that happens in this house. He said it without apparent emotion, which made it worse.
That's not new. I've operated under that condition for a long time.
Great, Elena said. And when were you planning to share that with the person you brought into the house? I didn't anticipate you becoming a point of interest. I'm a point of interest because you made me one. She kept her voice even. Every night you come to the workshop, every morning coffee on my work table. You think none of that is visible? He was quiet. Whatever I am in this equation, she said, I need to know what the equation is. He stood up from the desk, moved to the window. The courtyard outside was gray, early light flat on the stone. The collection is leverage, he said, his back partially to her. Pieces of it. There are people who believe certain works in this house were acquired in ways that create obligations they intend to collect. And are they right? A pause. About the acquisition methods. Some of them, partially. So the paintings have a problem provenance. Some of them have a complicated history, yes. Elena sat with that. She thought about the panel painting upstairs, the woman with her careful hands and her averted eyes. She thought about the copper painting's blue sky, clear and genuine under everything that had buried it. She thought about what she'd said in that first conversation with Massimo about provenance. Everything that's happened to an object is part of what it is. You can't separate the history from the thing. The Cortona panel, she said, the one Raffaele mentioned. Massimo turned from the window. Is that one of the complicated ones? She asked. The silence before his answer was a tenth of a second too long. Yes, he said. She looked at him. How complicated? He came back to the desk, sat down. And for the first time since she'd arrived in this house, she watched him look at something. Not at her, not at the window, just at the surface of the desk, with an expression that had something genuinely uncertain in it. The panel was acquired by my father, he said, in 1987. The seller was a private party in Florence. The documentation was complete at the time. And now? And now there are questions about the original ownership, whether the seller had the right to sell, whether the work was separated from its original institution during the war and never properly repatriated. Elena's stomach dropped. You knew this when you hired me, she said. I knew there were questions. I didn't know their current urgency. What changed? He looked at her directly. 3 weeks ago, an investigator from an international cultural property unit made contact with my legal team. They're building a case for repatriation. The panel is the centerpiece. The room was very quiet. And you hired a conservator to restore it, Elena said slowly, while an active investigation was in progress. The restoration doesn't affect the legal question. No, but my work on it does. She heard her own voice go flat. My condition reports, my documentation, my photographic record, everything I've been producing for 2 weeks, that's primary source material about the object's current state. If this goes to a tribunal, my work becomes evidence. He said nothing. Did your legal team advise you to have it documented? She asked, before the investigation advanced further. Elena, answer the question. A pause. Yes. She stood up. Her chair scraped back and she stood and she looked at him and felt something in her chest go very, very cold. Not the heat of anger, but the cold of it, the specific temperature of understanding something you can't ununderstand. You hired me to build a paper trail, she said. That's not the whole of it. But it's part of it. He looked at her. He didn't say no. She picked up her phone from the desk. I need to think. Elena. She walked out of the study. She walked back to the conservation wing, into her room, and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands pressed flat on her thighs and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd learned to manage her hands before delicate work. Steady the breath first, everything else follows. It wasn't working. She thought about every hour she'd spent on those paintings, the care she'd brought to them, the specific attention that was not just professional but personal, the way she'd talked to the panel painting in her head while she worked on it, the way she'd felt something close to joy when the copper sky came back. She thought about her condition reports, thorough and precise, time-stamped and photographed, admissible, authoritative, the work of someone with documented credentials and no apparent stake in the outcome. Perfect. In other words, for someone who needed an independent expert's assessment on record. She thought about the text. This isn't finished. She thought about the investigator from the cultural property unit.
She thought about Raphael saying, "You were going to give it to her anyway." He brings in an outsider and gives her access to pieces that have been in this family for generations. She thought about Massimo's face when she'd asked if the Cortona panel was one of the complicated ones. That tenth of a second pause. She had been used, again, by the same man who'd told her he'd protected her. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up, washed her face, and went to the conservation room. Not because she could work, because she needed to stand in the space and look at what she'd done and decide what it meant. The panel painting was on its easel. The consolidation had held perfectly. The surface was stable, the cleavage closed, the ground layer re-adhered with the kind of clean result that took years of practice to achieve consistently. The overpaint mapping was complete, photographed, referenced in her notes. 2 weeks of careful, expert work. She looked at it for a long time. The woman in the painting looked back at her, or not back exactly. Off to the side. That patient avoidance. As if she'd learned long ago that looking directly at difficult things only invited them closer. Elena understood her better than she had 2 weeks ago. She heard footsteps in the corridor and turned, expecting Massimo. It was Juliana. She came in without knocking. No one in this house knocked except Elena, now apparently, and stopped a few feet inside the room. She was dressed simply, her jaw-length hair precise, her expression carrying none of the flat hostility of the dinner. What it carried instead was something more complicated, something that looked almost like purpose. "He told you," Juliana said. Not a question. "About the panel?" "Yes." "Did he tell you everything?" Elena looked at her. "I'm starting to doubt he's told me anything close to everything." Juliana came further into the room. She looked at the panel painting, really looked at it, with the kind of attention that wasn't about aesthetics but about what it represented. "My uncle collects things," she said. "Artworks, properties, people." She glanced at Elena. "He doesn't mean to be cruel about it. He just categorizes. Everything becomes an asset, including me, including everyone." She turned back to the painting. "The investigation isn't only about the panel. You should know that." "What else is involved?" 7 pieces. The panel is the most significant, but there are 6 others. 2 more in this house, 4 in storage. All acquired by his father between 1979 and 1991. She paused. "My grandfather, who was not a good man in the ways that mattered." Elena absorbed that. "And Massimo? Is he trying to fight the repatriation?" "He's trying to control the timing of it." Juliana looked at her directly now. "There's a difference between fighting the truth and managing when it becomes visible." "Managing," Elena repeated, "like having a conservator document everything before the investigators can bring in their own expert." "Your report establishes current condition," Juliana said. "If the tribunal compares it to a restoration assessment from 10 years ago, which they will, and the current condition is significantly deteriorated, it strengthens the argument for immediate repatriation. If current condition is excellent, as it is now because of your work, it supports an argument for the object remaining in place pending negotiations." The sophistication of it settled over Elena like something heavy. "He stabilized the painting," she said, "through me, so that its condition couldn't be used as an argument against him." "Yes. And the documentation I've produced will be submitted to his legal team," Juliana said. "They've been waiting for it." Elena turned and looked at the copper painting on the second easel. The blue sky she'd spent days uncovering, the careful records she'd kept. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Juliana was quiet for a moment. "Because I've watched him do this to people before, and because you struck me as someone who'd rather know." She moved toward the door. "Also because what he's doing with the collection, the delay, the maneuvering, it's going to fail. The investigation is further along than his lawyers have told him. There's a hearing in 6 weeks. Your documentation will be subpoenaed regardless of whether he submits it voluntarily. And if I refuse to allow my work to be used, then you'll be subpoenaed directly." Juliana stopped at the door. "You're already in it, Ms. Hart. You've been in it since you signed the contract." She left. Elena stood in the conservation room and listened to the house breathe around her and thought about the contract. 2 pages, straightforward, specifying her scope of work and her compensation and the confidentiality clause that she'd read carefully and signed because the confidentiality had seemed like standard professional protection and nothing more. She pulled out her phone and read it again now. Paragraph 7. Subsection 3. All documentation, photography, condition reports, and written assessments produced during the engagement become the sole intellectual property of the client upon completion of each work phase. Her work, her records, her professional reputation attached to every page of it, his property. She put the phone down on the work table. She looked at her tools, the brushes, the scalpels, the solvent vials, the magnifying lens. Tools she'd bought herself, carried here herself, applied with her own hands and her own knowledge and her own irreplaceable trained attention. She thought about $47. 3 yellow envelopes, the cold rain in Brooklyn, and the desperate relief of a phone call she shouldn't have made before doing more research. She thought about Massimo in this room at midnight, sitting in the chair by the door, asking her, "Is it always like this?" Uncovering something that was always there but hidden. The way she'd answered him, the way she'd felt answering him. She picked up a scalpel from the tool tray, not with intent, just holding it, the familiar weight of a precise instrument in a hand that knew how to use it carefully. Then she set it down, walked to Massimo's study, and opened the door without knocking. He was standing at the window again. He turned when she came in. "Your lawyers are waiting for my documentation," she said. He didn't deny it. "Yes." "The hearing is in 6 weeks." A pause. Something shifted in his face. "How do you... It doesn't matter. Is it true?" "Yes." She walked to the center of the room and stopped. "You hired me under false pretenses." "I hired you to restore paintings," he said. "That's true and complete. The rest of it is circumstance." "Don't." Her voice came out harder than she intended, and she let it stay that way. "Don't manage the language with me. You knew what my documentation would be used for. You knew there was an active legal process. You brought me in without telling me any of it and had me produce materials that will now be used in a tribunal hearing in which I have no standing, no representation, and no ability to contextualize my own findings." He looked at her steadily, not defensive, not cold, something in between those things that was harder to argue against. "I needed the work done," he said. "You are the best person I could find to do it." "That doesn't justify what you didn't tell me." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She stared at him. The admission landed without ceremony, which was somehow worse than if he'd defended himself. She could push against defense. She didn't know what to do with this clean, unadorned acknowledgement that offered her nothing to escalate against. "The text," she said. "Last night. Who sent it?" He hesitated. "Massimo. A man named Pharaoh. He represents certain interests connected to my father's history." He moved away from the window. "He knows you're here. He's been watching the house since before you arrived." "What does he want?" "He wants the panel, not through repatriation, through his own channels." He stopped a few feet from her. "Your presence complicated his timeline. He had expected to make a move on the estate before the tribunal process advanced. Your documentation, the professional record you've been building, makes any unauthorized removal far more traceable. It's become an obstacle for him. Elena processed the architecture of that. "So I'm not just a legal instrument for your side," she said. "I'm also an interference for his side." "Yes." "And you knew this." "I suspected it. When the text came, I confirmed it." "How many sides are there?" she asked. Her voice had gone quiet. Not calm, quiet, which was different. The quiet of something compressed down past the point of obvious sound. "In this situation, 3, at minimum. And I'm standing in the middle of all of them." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The study was very still. Outside the window, the courtyard held a thin winter light that made everything look both clear and cold. "I want to see the full contract," she said. "Not the 2-page version I signed, the internal documentation, everything your legal team has regarding this engagement." "Elena, that's not a negotiation point," she said. "If I'm going to be subpoenaed, I need to know what I'm walking into. If I'm going to have my professional reputation attached to a tribunal proceeding, I need to understand its full context. And if you want me to continue working on those paintings, because right now I'm not sure I will, you give me everything, all of it." He looked at her for a long time. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "Pharaoh," he said. "He doesn't only want the panel.
He wants the documentation, specifically your condition reports, the photographs. He held her gaze. If he can get to your files before they're submitted to the tribunal, he can alter the record, establish a different condition history, one that supports a private transaction rather than a legal one. She felt the blood leave her face. He wants my files, she said. He wants what's on your laptop, your external drive, anything that hasn't yet been formally submitted. She thought about the supply cabinet, the camera angle Calla had mentioned, Raffaele in the corridor for 11 seconds with his back to the lens. She thought about how smoothly that had been executed, how professional. Raphael, she said. He wasn't working alone. Massimo's jaw tightened, the first crack in the composure she'd seen that was clearly involuntary. No, he said. He wasn't. He was working for Pharaoh. Silence. Your nephew, Elena said slowly, set me up at that dinner table, not because he objected to me professionally. He did it because someone paid him to get me out of the house before my documentation was complete, before it could be submitted and entered into the legal record. Massimo said nothing. He didn't need to. Elena stood in the middle of the room and felt the full shape of it settle into place, every piece of the last 2 weeks rearranging itself around this new center of gravity. The job offer that came at exactly the right moment of desperation, the access she'd been given, the coffee on her work table, the late nights in the conservation room. All of it real, she thought. She didn't believe it had all been manufactured, but real in a way that had been surrounded by something she hadn't been allowed to see. She was documentation. She was interference. She was a professional instrument deployed in a legal and criminal process that had been running for years before she ever answered that phone. And underneath all of that, the worst part, the part she could barely stand to look at directly, was the fact that she had felt something in this house. Not toward the paintings, toward the man standing 4 feet away from her who had used her honestly and dishonestly simultaneously, who came to her workspace at midnight and sat in the chair by the door and asked genuine questions about genuine things, who had told her the truth today when he could have continued managing her, but who had also never told her the things that would have made her say no. She picked up her phone from the desk where she'd left it earlier. I need to back up my files, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Somewhere off-site, somewhere not connected to this house or your legal team or anyone who knows my name in connection with this place. I can... Not you, she said. I'll do it myself. He looked at her. That look, the one that wasn't assessment and wasn't warmth and wasn't anything she had a clean name for. There's something you need to see first, he said quietly. He opened the desk drawer, took out a folder, held it out to her. She took it. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The top one was a printout of an email chain, dates going back 8 months, addresses she didn't recognize. She scanned the first exchange, then the second, then stopped on the third. Her name, her credentials, her Brooklyn address, in an email sent 7 months ago. 7 months before she'd received the job offer. She looked up at Massimo. You didn't find me through a referral, she said. No. You'd been looking for me specifically. For someone with your specific qualifications, he said, for a long time. She looked back at the email, the way her name sat in it, not as someone discovered, but as someone researched, identified, selected. The $47, she said, almost to herself. The bank balance, the yellow envelopes. You knew. We knew your financial situation made an immediate acceptance likely. The room tilted slightly, not physically, just the specific vertigo of understanding that the moment she'd believed was her own desperate decision, her choice, her agency, standing in her apartment on a rainy morning with a cold coffee and a number she'd called because she had nothing left, had been engineered. Not the desperation. That had been real. But the timing of the offer, the precision of it, the $4,000 a week and the accommodation, arriving at exactly the moment when she had no other... The folder was still in her hands. She looked at the email chain for another 10 seconds. Her name sitting in it with the specific stillness of something that had been decided before she knew there was a decision being made. And then she set the folder on the desk with the particular precision of someone choosing not to throw it. How long? She said. 7 months of identification and verification. The offer was made when the timing aligned.
When my rent was 3 months behind.
Yes. She looked at him. You monitored my financial records. We monitored publicly available indicators. The gallery you contracted with filed a late payment notice. Your building... Stop! She held up one hand. I don't want the methodology. He stopped. She walked to the window and stood where he'd been standing earlier, looking out at the courtyard. The stone was dark with morning damp. A single bird moved across the gray sky above the walls and was gone.
7 months. While she'd been in her apartment struggling, believing she was navigating her own failure and her own choices, she had been observed, assessed, timed. The desperation she'd have felt. Real. The cold coffee, the yellow envelopes, the bank balance that wouldn't move, all real. Her own. But the door that had opened at exactly that moment was not chance. It had been built and positioned and left unlocked by someone who had calculated precisely when she would have no choice but to walk through it. She turned around. The paintings, she said, the actual restoration work. Was any of it, was the work itself real? Did you actually need them restored? He looked at her without deflection. Yes. The panel's instability was genuine, the copper's varnish, the canvas tear. All of it needed attention. But the timing served multiple purposes, he said. Yes. You could have hired anyone. I needed someone whose professional credibility was unimpeachable. He paused, and whose personal situation meant they would stay. She heard that clearly. Stay. Not just accept the job. Stay when it became uncomfortable. Stay when the dinner table turned against her. Stay when the text arrived in the dark. You knew I'd stay, she said. I believed you would. Because I needed the money. Because, he said carefully, of who you are. The money was the mechanism, not the reason. She looked at him for a long moment. That answer was more dangerous than any of the others because it was the one she couldn't entirely refuse. She knew the difference between staying for money and staying because she couldn't make herself leave something unfinished. She'd always known that about herself. It was both her best quality and the one that had cost her the most. I need to make a call, she said. Elena, not to anyone you need to worry about. She picked up her phone. I need to talk to my lawyer. He blinked. It was the first genuine surprise she'd seen on his face. You have a lawyer. I have a friend from NYU who passed the bar and owes me a significant favor. She was already finding the number. I'll use your study if you don't mind, or even if you do. He moved toward the door, stopped. The files. Back them up today. Use a personal device, not the house network. I know, she said. I was going to. He left. She called Maya Osei Bonsu, who had been her roommate for 2 years in graduate school, and who is now a cultural property attorney in Midtown, and who answered on the third ring with the voice of someone who had been awake since 5 and had already dealt with 2 impossible things before breakfast. Elena talked for 11 minutes. She kept it factual and sequential. Maya listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her and indicated seriousness. When Elena finished, the silence on the line lasted 4 seconds. Okay, Maya said. First question. Do you still have physical access to all your documentation? Yes. Second question. Has anything been submitted anywhere yet? Not that I know of. Third question. Is there a safe way to get you and your files out of that building in the next several hours? Elena looked at the study door. I don't know yet. Find out, Maya said. And don't touch the paintings again until we talk. Your hands leave your own legal position the moment you continue work with full knowledge of the situation. Call me back in 2 hours. She hung up. Elena sat in Massimo's chair, right? She'd sat in it before, she noticed, the day of the Raphael confrontation. And she noticed she was doing it again, and thought about Maya's 3 questions. Access, submission, exit. She had 2 hours. She went to her room first, pulled her external hard drive from her bag, connected it to her laptop. Her personal laptop, brought from Brooklyn, not connected to the house network, copied every file, every condition report, every UV photograph, every treatment record with its timestamp and signature, 3 gigabytes of meticulous professional work. While it copied, she watched the progress bar and felt the strange double quality of the moment. The documents were her best work. She was genuinely proud of them. And they were also the thing that multiple parties were trying to use, manipulate, or steal. She was proud of the work and enraged that it had been used. Both were true simultaneously, and she didn't try to resolve that. The copy completed. She put the drive in her jacket pocket. Then she went to the conservation room. She stood in front of the panel painting. The woman with the averted eyes looked back at her, or not back, to the side, that same careful avoidance. The surface was stable now, the cleavage closed, the ground secure. Whatever happened next, the painting was safer than it had been when she arrived. That was true, and it was hers, regardless of what the legal record said about ownership of her documentation. She was still standing there when Calla appeared. Ms. Hart. Her face was different. There's someone at the gate. Who? He gave the name Pharaoh. The air in the room changed temperature by several degrees. Does Massimo know? He's being informed now. He asks that you go to the East Corridor room and wait. No, Elena said. Calla looked at her with the flat assessment of someone recalibrating. Mr. Varela was clear. I understand what he was clear about. She picked up her phone. Tell him I'm in the conservation room. If he wants to tell me where to go, he can come tell me himself. Calla left at a pace that was as close to running as her bearing allowed. Elena stood in the conservation room and thought about Pharaoh. A man connected to Massimo's father's world who wanted the panel, who had sent a 3-word text to a woman he'd never met to warn her that the machinery around her was still running. A man who had apparently paid Raphael to get her out of the house, who was now at the gate. She thought about the external drive in her pocket. 3 gigabytes. Massimo came through the door 2 minutes later. His face was controlled, but the pace at which he moved wasn't. Something had broken through the measured rhythm of him, and she could see it in the way he covered the distance between the door and her position in fewer steps than usual. I told Calla, I heard, I'm not going to sit in a room and wait. She held his gaze. What does he want? He wants a meeting. With you. With both of us, Massimo said. That landed. He knows you have the files, Massimo said. He knows the copy was made this morning. His jaw was tight. The house network flagged the file sizes, even though you used your own device. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated that. She felt cold. He has someone inside the house. He had someone inside the house. Past tense. Calla identified the monitoring software on the network hub at 7 this morning. The staff member responsible has been removed. Who? One of the kitchen staff. Recent hire. He paused. I should have been more careful. Elena looked at the hard drive in her jacket, pressed her hand briefly against the outside of the pocket. Still there. He knows I have it, but he doesn't have it. Correct. So a meeting is his way of getting close enough to negotiate, Massimo said, or to assess what other options are available. What are his other options? Massimo looked at her directly. I need you to understand something before this goes further. I need you to answer the question. His other options, Massimo said carefully, include a direct approach to you as an individual, outside this house, after you leave. The silence was complete. He would come after me, she said, not violently. Pharaoh is not that kind of man, but he has resources and patience, and he knows you will eventually leave this building. He paused. Your professional credibility is the asset. Your testimony, if this goes to a tribunal. He would find ways to apply pressure to that. Discredit me. Or recruit you. Offer you something that made it worth your while to present your findings in a particular light. She thought about $47. She thought about the yellow envelopes. She thought about how well someone had read her situation 7 months ago and how Pharaoh presumably had access to the same information. And if I go into this meeting, she said, what exactly am I walking into? A man who wants to know which way you'll fall when this is over. Which way will I fall? Massimo looked at her. Something in his expression was stripped back. Not vulnerable, that wasn't the right word, but less armored than she'd seen it. Like he'd made a decision to show her the room behind the door rather than manage what she was allowed to see of it. I don't know, he said. I genuinely don't know. And I think that's what he wants to assess. She took a breath. Set up the meeting. Elena, I've been a piece on this board since before I knew there was a board.
I'm not going to sit in a room and let two men decide what happens to my work and my professional future without being in the room. She looked at him. Set it up. He looked at her for one more moment, then he picked up his phone.
Pharaoh came in through the main entrance 40 minutes later, which was enough time for Elena to change out of her work clothes, which she did not because of him, but because she was not going to sit across from a man who wanted to assess her while she smelled like solvent. She wore the same dark green she'd worn to the dinner. It had not served her well last time. She put it on anyway. The meeting room was not the dining room and not the study. A smaller space off the main corridor, 4 chairs around a square table, nothing on the walls. Neutral ground, in the grammar of this house. Pharaoh was smaller than she'd expected. Mid-60s, compact, with the kind of face that had been handsome 20 years ago and had settled into a different kind of distinction. Angular, watchful, the eyes doing most of the work. He dressed well without effort. He stood when she came in, which was a formality she noted without being disarmed by. "Ms. Hart," he gestured to the chair across from him. "Please." Massimo sat to her right, not at the head of the table, beside her. She noticed that. "Mr. Pharaoh," she said. He looked at her with the specific attention of someone who had read a file about you and was now reconciling the file with the person. "I'll be direct," he said. "I found that directness saves everyone a great deal of time." "I found that too," Elena said. Something moved in his eyes. Slight. "The documentation you've produced over the past 2 weeks is significant, professionally thorough, the kind of record that will carry considerable weight in a legal proceeding." He folded his hands on the table. "The question of how that weight is applied is still open." "It's not open," she said. "It's my documentation. I determine how it's characterized." "You determine the professional interpretation," he agreed, "within the scope of your methodology. But the framing of findings, the context in which a tribunal receives them, that's shaped by more than methodology." "Are you asking me to shade my findings?" "I'm suggesting that professional assessments exist on a continuum," he said pleasantly. "A condition that is stable could be described as stable and progressing well, or as stable but historically compromised. Both true. Different implications." "I know how language works," Elena said. "Then you understand what I'm describing." "I understand that you want me to introduce doubt into my own record," she said. "Frame the panel's condition in a way that suggests instability the collection can't manage. Make the case for removal." He smiled. "Not warm, accurate." "You're very good." "What are you offering?" Massimo shifted beside her. Barely, a millimeter of movement, but she felt it. "Clearance," Pharaoh said, "from the parties I represent, your name, your credentials, your future practice. Untouched. No complications from individuals with long memories and considerable reach." A pause. "And a direct payment. Substantial." "How substantial?" He named a number. She felt the number in her stomach the way she'd once felt a step that wasn't there. The sudden drop, the instinctive catch. It was the kind of number that solved problems. Multiple years of problems. The kind of number that turned $47 and yellow envelopes into a memory rather than a recurring threat. She looked at the table for 3 seconds. Long enough to be honest about what the number felt like. Short enough that it didn't look like consideration. "No," she said. Pharaoh looked at her. The pleasantness didn't drop. It just became information. "Ms. Hart, my documentation is accurate," she said. "It will be submitted accurately. If a tribunal wants my testimony, I'll give it accurately. That's the only version of me that's available. You understand the complications I mentioned are not hypothetical." "I understand that." She held his gaze. "I also understand that the moment I compromise my professional record, I have nothing left. Not career, not credibility, not the thing I've spent 10 years building." She paused. "You can't actually take more from me than that offer would." Pharaoh looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Massimo. "She's genuinely like this," Massimo said, quietly. "Apparently," Pharaoh said. He sat back slightly. "Then we have a different conversation." "What conversation is that?" she asked. "The conversation about what happens when the tribunal convenes in 6 weeks and your documentation enters the record and the panel is ordered removed." He looked at Massimo. "What happens to the other pieces, the ones in storage, the ones that have been part of this collection for 30 years, and that certain parties have different ideas about than the legal system does?" "That's your conversation," Elena said. "Not mine. It becomes yours, he said, if the tribunal calls you back for follow-up testimony, which they will. Your assessment will raise questions your initial report doesn't fully answer. You'll be pulled back in. He leaned forward slightly. Unless the matter is resolved before the hearing, privately, without your involvement going any further. Elena felt the shape of what he was now describing. Not offering her money to compromise her work, offering her an exit, a clean disappearance from the whole situation, if Massimo conceded something before the hearing made it all public. You're not talking to me anymore, she said. You're talking to him. I'm the leverage. Pharaoh looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. Now you are. She stood up. Both men looked at her. Then there's nothing more for me in this room, she said. She walked to the door. Her heartbeat was audible inside her own skull, and her hands were entirely steady, and she was thinking about Maya's question. Is there a safe way to get you and your files out of that building? And understanding that the answer had just changed shape. Because Pharaoh didn't need the files anymore. He needed her. Her presence, her upcoming testimony, her professional exposure to a process she couldn't step away from now that she was fully in it. She was the leverage. She stopped at the door with her hand on the frame. Without turning, she said, Mr. Pharaoh, the text you sent me last night. Yes. This isn't finished, she said. That's what you wrote. It is. You were right. She turned enough to look at him over her shoulder, but not in the way you meant. She walked out of the room into the corridor. The house was very quiet around her. She could hear the specific quality of that quiet now. Not the peace of it, but the held breath quality. The whole structure of the place suspended in something that was about to resolve one way or another. She walked to the conservation room, stood in front of the panel painting one more time. The woman with the averted eyes, the stabilized ground, the surface that had been brought back from the edge of irreversible damage by 2 weeks of patient, careful, expert hands. Her phone buzzed. Maya. She answered it. 2 hours, Maya said. Talk to me. I need you to file a protective declaration on my documentation, Elena said. Today. Establishing my independent professional standing before it's submitted to anyone else. I can do that. Anything else? I need to know whether voluntary disclosure to the tribunal, going directly to them before either party submits anything, gives me any protected status as a cooperating professional. Maya was quiet for 2 seconds. It might. Depends on the jurisdiction and the specific investigative body. Give me the case details. I don't have all of them. Get them. I know where to get them, Elena said. She hung up, turned away from the painting, walked back out of the conservation room and down the corridor toward the study, where she knew, with the specific certainty that came from 2 weeks of learning the rhythm of this house, that Massimo would already be. He was. Pharaoh was gone. The study felt smaller with just the two of them in it, the afternoon light flattening on the desk between them. She came to the center of the room and stopped. I need the full case file, she said. The investigator's contact, the tribunal details, everything your legal team has. He looked at her. Why? Because I'm going to contact them directly, before either you or Pharaoh gets there first. She held his gaze. And I need to know all of it. Right now, no management, no careful language. Whether there is anything in your use of my work that exposes me to legal liability, not professionally, criminally. The question sat in the air between them. Massimo's jaw was set. The fatigue around his eyes had gone past the surface now. It was structural, the kind that came from years of maintaining a position that required constant, exhausting vigilance. He opened the desk drawer, pulled out the full folder, thicker than the 3-page version he'd shown her earlier, set it on the desk. Read it, he said. She came to the desk, opened the folder. The first page was a case summary from the International Cultural Property Unit. 15 months of investigation, 7 pieces identified, provenance gaps documented back to 1943. The Cortona panel was listed as primary object of interest, acquisition chain broken at a 1944 transfer in Florence that the investigators believed was coerced. She turned to the second page and stopped. At the bottom of the second page, under a subheading that read Associated Parties, Current Custodial Period, there was a list of names, lawyers, advisors, People connected to the management of the collection since Massimo had inherited it from his father. The fourth name on the list was one she recognized, not from this house, from before, from the museum, from the conservation lab where she'd spent 4 years and worked on a Caravaggio and been told her hands were the steadiest her supervisor had ever seen. Her former supervisor's name was on the list. She stared at it. Dr. Hendrik Voss, senior curator, formerly of the Metropolitan Conservation Department, now listed as an advisory consultant to the Varela collection. The man who had told her she had genuine instinct. The man who had written the recommendation letter she'd used to establish her independent practice. The man whose professional endorsement was embedded in her credibility the way a signature was embedded in a painting's corner. Small, essential, the thing that made authentication possible. He was in this. He had been in this before she had. She looked up at Massimo slowly. "Voss?" she said. Massimo's expression told her everything she needed to know about whether he'd expected her to reach that page this quickly. "He consulted on the acquisition records," Massimo said. "He helped establish the collection's provenance documentation when my father died and I took over, 6 years ago." "He helped establish it," Elena said. "Or helped construct it." The silence in the room was the loudest thing she'd heard since she'd arrived. "Both," Massimo said. Her hands were on this folder and she became aware of a trembling in them that she hadn't noticed until now. Not from fear, from the specific physical response to a scale of betrayal that the body registered before the mind fully caught up. Voss, who had mentored her, who had shaped what she understood about the ethics of this work, who had told her that integrity and conservation was not optional, was not contextual, was the only thing that made the profession worth doing, who had been building false provenance documentation for a collection with wartime acquisition gaps for 6 years, and whose endorsement was the foundation of her professional reputation. If his credibility collapsed, when his credibility collapsed, because this file was going to a tribunal, and the truth of what he'd done was going to become public, it would take hers with it. Not because she'd done anything wrong, because her name was tied to his in the record, because attribution worked in both directions. She was not just leverage anymore. She was not just leverage anymore. She was evidence. The distinction arrived in her chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. Not leverage, which implied future use, negotiating value, a chip held over the table. Evidence, which meant her presence in this house, her hands on those paintings, her meticulous 2 weeks of documented professional work. All of it was now part of a chain of proof that connected directly to a man whose name was the architectural foundation of everything she'd built since leaving the museum. Voss. She closed the folder, pressed both palms flat on the cover. "When did you know he trained me?" she asked. Massimo didn't hesitate. "Before I hired you. That's why you hired me." It wasn't a question. Not just my credentials, my specific connection to him. "Yes. Because if his credibility comes apart in the tribunal, the association creates a useful complication," he said, "for the investigators, for the case." She understood the architecture of it now in full. Voss had helped construct false provenance documentation for the collection 6 years ago. The investigators knew this or suspected it. If Voss's credibility was successfully challenged, the documentation he'd helped build became suspect. If that documentation became suspect, the tribunal's timeline for the repatriation case could be delayed, months, possibly years, while the provenance records were re-examined. And Elena's professional connection to Voss, an independent, credentialed expert with a clean record and no apparent stake in the outcome, could be used to muddy that challenge, either as a character reference for Voss or as a counter-expert whose independent findings complicated the investigator's narrative. Massimo had not brought her in to restore paintings and generate incidental documentation. He had brought her in because of what her name meant next to Voss's name. She stood up slowly from the desk. Her legs felt strange, not weak, just distant. The physical sensation that came when the mind was carrying too much at once and the body temporarily deprioritized itself. "I need to make a call," she said. Same words as before, but different in her mouth now. "Elena." "No." She looked at him, just once, the full weight of it. "Don't say my name right now like you know what it cost me to hear what I just read. Don't do that." He was quiet. She walked out. Not to the conservation room this time. To her bedroom. She closed the door, sat on the floor with her back against the bed, not the edge of it, the floor, the hardest surface available, and called Maya. "I need you to tell me something," she said when Maya answered. "Okay, if I go to the tribunal investigators voluntarily, today, before anything is submitted, is there a version of this where Voss's connection to the collection stays separate from my work? Where my documentation stands on its own evidentiary value without being contaminated by whatever he did?" Silence on the line. The specific silence of someone doing real work with the information you've just given them. "Possibly," Maya said. "If you can demonstrate that your engagement with the collection was independent of his advisory role, that you had no knowledge of his involvement until today, and if your methodology is clean and your findings are accurately reported, there's a reasonable argument for evidentiary separation." "How reasonable? 60-40. Maybe." A pause. "But Elena, if you go to them voluntarily, you lose the ability to control how your name appears in the public record. Once you're a cooperating professional in a cultural property case, that follows you." "It follows me either way," Elena said. "At least this way I choose what it says about me." Silence again. Then, "Tell me everything, from the beginning. Don't skip anything." She talked for 23 minutes. Maya listened, interrupted twice for clarification, and at the end said, "Give me 2 hours. Don't touch the files. Don't talk to Massimo or Pharaoh or anyone in that house until you hear back from me." Elena hung up, sat on the floor. The room was very quiet. Through the window, the courtyard was going blue with early dusk, the stone taking on the particular quality of winter light at the end of the day, cold, clear, honest in its absence of warmth. She thought about Voss. She thought about the way he'd stood behind her in the conservation lab when she was 27 years old, looking over her shoulder at a damaged Flemish portrait, and said, "The paint layer is telling you what it needs. You have to listen before you act." She had written that down in her notebook that night. She had kept the notebook. She still had it somewhere in the Brooklyn apartment. She thought about what it meant to have the person who taught you the ethics of a thing be the person who'd been violating those ethics for 6 years before you walked into his radius. It didn't make his teaching wrong. That was the particular bitterness of it. The lesson had been true. The teacher had been false. And she had to hold both of those things without letting one destroy the other, because the lesson was all she had. She sat on the floor until the room was fully dark. Then she got up, turned on the lamp, and waited for Maya to call back. Maya called at 7:43. "Here's what I've arranged," she said without preamble. "There's an investigator named Delaney attached to the Cultural Property Unit. She's agreed to an informal preliminary meeting tomorrow morning at 9, off-site. You bring your documentation, your professional records, and a signed statement of independent engagement. I'll be there. Tomorrow morning. You need 1 night to prepare the statement. Don't rush it. The statement is the thing that establishes your position before anything else is defined." Maya's voice was precise and without comfort, which was exactly what Elena needed. "Can you hold it together in that house for 1 more night?" "Yes." "Good. And Elena, this is going to be messy for a while. You understand that?" "I understand. The case will be public when it goes to hearing. Your name will be in it." "I know. And Voss?" "I know," Elena said. "I know what it means." She hung up, sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting the statement. She worked for 4 hours, precise, sequential, factual. Every date, every instruction she'd been given, every conversation she could accurately reconstruct, every document she'd been shown, and when. She wrote it the way she wrote condition reports, without editorializing, without the personal register, with only the information that could be verified against the physical record. It was the hardest kind of writing, the kind that required you to discipline your anger out of every sentence and let the facts carry the weight the anger wanted to. At midnight, she heard the familiar footsteps in the corridor. They stopped outside her door. She kept writing. He didn't knock. For the first time in a week, he didn't even pause. He just stood on the other side of the door in silence, and after a moment, she heard him walk away. She finished the statement at 1 a.m, read it through twice, sent it to Maya. Then she sat back and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who had just done something that couldn't be undone. Morning came, 6 o'clock. She rose, showered, dressed, packed her personal belongings methodically into her suitcase. Clothes, toiletries, the small things that had accumulated on the bedside table over 2 weeks. The NYU graduation photo she'd kept in her bag since Brooklyn. Her tools went into their case with the specific attention she always gave them, every instrument in its place. She carried her bags to the conservation room and set them at the door. Then she stood at each easel one last time, the panel painting first, the woman with the averted eyes, the stabilized surface, the ground layer that would hold now for decades if the climate conditions were maintained. She was better than she'd been, genuinely better. Whatever happened to her legally, physically, she was sound. That was Elena's work. That was real. The copper painting, the sky she'd uncovered, that specific blue-gray of last light, the red glaze in the trees that changed the whole emotional register of the piece. She'd never finished the full varnish removal. Someone else would complete it. She hoped they were careful with the glazing. She hoped they understood that the original color relationships were doing something technically sophisticated in the distance recession, and that a careless cleaning pass in the midground would destroy 40 years of an artist's layering intention. She hoped. That was all she could do. The canvas with the tear, she hadn't started it yet. It would wait. She turned off the lights above the easels one by one, picked up her bags. Massimo was in the corridor. He was not positioned to stop her. He was simply standing, as though he had been there for some time and had not decided what to do with the fact of his own presence. His jacket was off. His sleeves were turned back. He looked like he'd been awake longer than she had. She stopped. They looked at each other in the corridor light. That flat, institutional corridor with its closed doors and its history of footsteps she'd spent 2 weeks learning to identify. "The meeting with Delaney," he said. 9 o'clock. She kept her face neutral. "How do you know about that?" "Maya Osebonsu has represented 2 cultural property cases connected to this investigation in the past 3 years," he said. Delaney was the lead investigator on both. When my legal team flagged an informal meeting request on her calendar for tomorrow morning, the name was not difficult to connect. Elena looked at him steadily. "And?" "And nothing." He met her gaze. "I'm not going to interfere with it." She absorbed that. "Your lawyers—" "I've told my legal team to stand down," he said. "From you specifically. Your documentation will be treated as independent professional material. They won't submit it. They won't reference it. Whatever you present to Delaney, you present on your own terms." She searched his face for the calculation in that. The angle. The next move in the sequence. She didn't find one, which meant either it wasn't there or he'd gotten better at hiding it than she was at reading him, and she didn't know which of those was more likely. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Because you were right. About what I didn't tell you. About what I used without explaining." He looked at the wall beside her rather than at her, which was the first time he'd redirected a difficult thing rather than looking directly at it. "I told myself the work was real, and the purpose served necessary ends, and that the distinction between those things was sufficient. It isn't." "No," she said, "it isn't. Voss is going to be called in the hearing. His role will be fully disclosed. Whatever that does to your professional history—" He stopped. Exhaled through his nose, a controlled sound that was the closest thing to genuine distress she'd witnessed from him. "I'm sorry for that specifically. Not as a formal apology. As a fact." Elena looked at him for a long time. She thought about all the ways she could answer that. The anger was still there, not hot anymore, not the sharp immediate kind, but the settled variety that had moved past the point of needing expression and become simply part of the landscape of this experience. She would carry it for a while. That was honest. But underneath the anger, and beneath the exhaustion, and beneath the particular disillusionment of learning that the person you'd allowed yourself to be moved by had moved you partly by design, underneath all of that, she found something she hadn't expected. Clarity. Not peace, not resolution, just the specific clarity that arrived when you had finally seen everything there was to see about a situation and could assess it without the distortion of hope or fear. He was a man who had inherited a world he hadn't entirely chosen and had managed it with the tools that world gave him: control, calculation, strategic silence, and those tools had worked until they'd met someone who wouldn't be managed. He had done things that were wrong. He had also, somewhere in the middle of all of it, done things that were real.
The midnight coffee, the questions about the work, the moment in the study when he'd handed her the full folder and said read it instead of curating what she was allowed to know, the standing down of his legal team this morning.
None of that canceled the other, but she was done trying to make one disappear in favor of the other. Voss built his own record, she said. That's not yours to apologize for. No, but the position it puts you in is mine to handle. She shifted her bags on her shoulder. Which I'm going to. He nodded once. His eyes were very direct. The panel painting needs climate monitoring, she said. The humidity in the conservation room runs low in winter, below 40%. It needs to stay between 45 and 55, or the consolidation I did will start to reverse within a year. Tell whoever takes over the work. I'll tell them. And the copper piece, the glazing in the midground is original. Anyone who cleans it needs to understand that the color relationships in the distance are intentional and technically sophisticated. Don't let them overclean it chasing the surface brightness. I'll make sure. She looked at him one more time. The corridor between them was 4 feet of floor and 2 weeks of everything this story had been. Goodbye, Mr. Varela, she said. Something in his face moved. Not quite pain, not quite the absence of it. Ms. Hart, he said. She walked to the main entrance. Calla was there with Elena's coat, holding it out without ceremony, which was its own form of dignity. Elena took it. The East Corridor camera, Elena said. The one with the wider angle. It made the difference. Calla looked at her. I know, she said. Take care of yourself. Elena walked out through the gate into the cold morning air of the Upper East Side. The gate closed behind her with a soft, definitive sound. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, suitcase in one hand, tool case in the other, the hard drive in her jacket pocket pressing against her ribs with the specific weight of 3 gigabytes of honest work. The street was quiet, early enough that the neighborhood hadn't fully started yet. A doorman down the block, a woman walking a dog, the distant sound of a delivery truck somewhere on the avenue. Ordinary life, going about its ordinary business, indifferent to what had just concluded behind the limestone walls. She walked to the corner and got into the car Maya had sent. The meeting with Delaney lasted 2.5 hours. The investigator was younger than Elena had expected, early 40s, with the specific manner of someone who had spent years learning to make people comfortable enough to be completely honest. She asked precise questions and wrote things down with a pen, which Elena found unexpectedly steadying, the analog quality of it, ink on paper. Maya sat beside Elena and said almost nothing, which meant everything Elena said was exactly what needed saying. She presented her documentation, her statement, her professional history with Voss, the mentorship, the recommendation letters, the ways his name was woven into her credibility. She said it all clearly. She did not minimize Voss, and she did not perform distress about him. She stated the facts of her training and her subsequent independence and the complete separation of her methodology from anything he had done with the collection. Delaney listened, looked up occasionally with the quality of assessment that was about verification rather than judgment. At the end, she said, "Your documentation will be entered as independent professional evidence. Your connection to Voss will be noted and contextually explained. The tribunal will treat your findings on their own merit." "And my name in the public record?" Elena asked. "You'll be identified as a cooperating independent expert, not a party to the investigation." A pause. "I want to be honest with you. It will be visible. The case will receive attention, but your position in it will be clean." Elena nodded. Clean. Not painless. Not invisible. Clean. She walked out of the building with Maya beside her into a noon that had turned unexpectedly bright. The winter sun doing something ambitious with the cold air, throwing the city into sharp relief. "You okay?" Maya asked. "Not entirely," Elena said. "But I know what I'm dealing with." Maya nodded. She'd always respected that answer more than the ones that claimed otherwise. They hugged briefly on the sidewalk. Maya went back to her office. Elena stood with her bags and thought about Brooklyn. She went home. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Canvases against the wall, tools in their case, the smell of turpentine and old wood, and the ghost of that half-eaten granola bar. She opened the window despite the cold, stood in the specific silence of her own space for a long time. The 3 yellow envelopes were still on the workbench. She picked them up, found her checkbook, wrote 3 checks with the first week's payment from the Varela engagement, which had been deposited into her account on schedule despite everything, and put them in their return envelopes. Rent through next month. Not comfortable, but not drowning. She made coffee. Real coffee, the careful kind, not the forgotten kind. Stood at her own window and drank it and watched the street below. 3 weeks later, she received a formal letter from the Cultural Property Tribunal requesting her documentation for the proceedings. She submitted it through Maya with a covering statement that had been reviewed by 3 different sets of eyes and was airtight in its professional clarity. Her work entered the record. The panel painting's condition, the copper's varnish history, the tear in the 3rd canvas, all of it documented and time-stamped and accurate. Voss was called before the tribunal the following month. His advisory role in the provenance documentation was fully disclosed. The records he had helped construct were found to contain material misrepresentations. His professional standing was suspended pending further investigation. Elena read the report on the tribunal's public disclosure site at 6 in the morning, sitting at her workbench with the same coffee ritual. She read it through twice. Then she closed the laptop, picked up a brush, and went back to a painting she'd been restoring for a private client in Cobble Hill, a 19th century landscape that had been sitting under 3 layers of conservation tape and bad varnish since the 70s. She worked for 2 hours before stopping. She thought about what Voss had said in the lab all those years ago. The paint layer is telling you what it needs. You have to listen before you act. It was still true. It had always been true. The man who'd said it had been false in ways that mattered enormously and that had cost her real things. Her professional comfort, a period of sleep, the specific grief of finding corruption in a mentor. But the teaching was separate from the teacher. She had to let it be separate, not to excuse him, to keep the thing that was genuinely hers. She went back to the landscape. She was working the following week when her phone rang. Unknown number, 212 area code. She looked at it for 3 rings. Then she answered. Ms. Hart. The voice was measured, accented, unhurried. The same voice as a phone call 2 months ago that had lasted less than 2 minutes and set everything else in motion. I wanted to know if the work was completed before the tribunal took possession. She set down her brush. The consolidation on the panel held, she said. The copper piece still needs finishing. The canvas tear wasn't started. A pause. I see. The climate conditions need monitoring through winter, she said. Whoever continues the work needs to know that. I've been told. Another pause, longer. The panel is going back to Florence, he said. The tribunal decided last week. I didn't contest it. She hadn't expected that. She sat with it for a moment. How do you feel about that? A silence that wasn't evasion, just thought. I think, he said carefully, that some things belong somewhere specific, and that the fact of their having been elsewhere for a long time doesn't change where they belong. She looked at the landscape in front of her, the 19th century trees, the light she was slowly returning to them. That's true, she said. How are you? He asked. The question was simple. It wasn't managed or strategic. It was the kind of question that cost something to ask. Working, she said. Brooklyn, same tools. Good. She thought about the courtyard, the stone fountain she'd seen through her window on cold mornings, the specific quality of the silence in that house, how it had changed meaning over 2 weeks from something impenetrable to something she could almost read. The copper painting, she said. When someone finishes it, make sure they know the sky is genuine. Don't let them overcorrect for the color temperature. The original artist was going for something specific in that light. I'll make sure they know, he said. A pause between them, long enough to hold everything it needed to. Goodbye, Mr. Varela, she said. Goodbye, Miss Hart. She ended the call, set the phone down, picked up her brush. Outside her window, Brooklyn was doing what it did in late winter, gray and cold and entirely itself, the street below full of people going about the ordinary urgent business of being alive in a city that had no interest in anyone's complications. A taxi, a woman with a stroller, 2 men arguing over a parking space with the cheerful ferocity of people who had nothing genuinely at stake. She looked at the landscape on her work table. The trees were coming back. The original depth of green beneath the yellowed surface, the way the painter had built the light from behind the foliage rather than in front of it. A technical choice that made the whole thing breathe differently once you understood it. Alive in a way that the buried version wasn't. True in a way that the covered version could never be. She dipped her brush. There were things she would carry from those 2 weeks in the limestone house that she wouldn't be able to put down for a long time. The specific intelligence of being used by someone who had also genuinely seen her. The grief of Voss, not dramatic grief, not the movie version, but the quiet, persistent kind that surfaced sometimes when she was doing very careful work and heard his instruction in her own hands. The particular experience of walking out of a room with her back straight and her voice level when everything inside her was something else entirely. She would carry those things, and she would keep working. Not because it was all she had, she understood now, with the specific clarity of someone who'd been through a fire and come out not unburned but intact, that it was genuinely what she chose. This, the brush and the surface and the slow, patient work of returning something to what it had always been underneath everything that had buried it. There was no version of that which could be taken from her. Not by legal proceedings or professional contamination or the calculated use of her name in someone else's equation. Not by a mentor who turned out to be false or a man who turned out to be more complicated than any clean narrative could contain. She worked until the light in her apartment shifted to the particular flat gold of late afternoon. She photographed the day's progress, wrote her notes, cleaned her brushes in the methodical way that was both professional habit and a kind of ritual completion. The end of the day's work acknowledged properly, not just abandoned. She made dinner, ate it at the workbench while reading, something old, a book she'd read before, the kind of reading that was company rather than information. Before she went to bed, she stood in front of the window for a moment. The street was quieter now. Night had done what night did with the city, not silenced it, just lowered the register, the way a painting's values shifted as the light source changed. The same scene, different light, different meaning in the relationships between things. She thought about a woman in a 500-year-old painting, looking not at the viewer but at something slightly to the left of frame. Her hands folded with the patience that was not peace but endurance, the weight in her eyes that understood something about waiting without surrendering. She thought about what Massimo had said in the conservation room, the night he'd sat in the chair by the door and asked her if it was always like this, uncovering what was always there, but hidden. She had said yes. It was still yes. The work didn't change. The world around the work changed constantly. Venal and political and full of people using beautiful things as instruments of other agendas. But the work itself, the actual thing that happened between trained hands and a damaged surface, and the slow, patient return of original truth, that didn't change. That was hers. She turned off the lamp, went to bed. In the morning, she would get up and work. That was enough. It was, she had learned at real cost and without the comfort of easy resolution, exactly enough.